the German Empire, from 1888 to 1914. Henry Adams was an American historian who spent a lot of time in Europe. In the year 1897, he wrote from Paris, "The center of movement in the world is not in Russia and not in America. It is in Germany. Since 1865, Germany has been the big troublemaker. As long as its power keeps growing, there won't be peace, political or economic. Russia can grow without breaking the system. Germany cannot. Russia is weak and falling apart in some ways. But Germany is strong and focused. It has all the advantages." 4 years later, Adams wrote again, this time from St. Petersburg. "Germany looks like a powder keg. Everyone around it is scared it will explode. And one day, it will." He wasn't the only one who thought this way. Many people believe that Germany, around the year 1900, had become a new superpower. It was moving forward fast, but it couldn't grow like that forever. It had to explode at some point. Germany couldn't find a lasting way of life. If this was true, then the First World War was only a matter of time. Then, maybe, the history of Emperor Wilhelm II was like a river rushing toward a waterfall. It couldn't be stopped. Many historians see it that way, not usually German ones, though. They wanted the war in 1914 to look like an accident or a trick by Germany's enemies. But others, including German critics, looked deeper. They said the war was always going to happen. It was part of how the German Empire was built. Bismarck had laid the foundation, and Wilhelm pushed it to its extreme. Some even say the Second World War came straight out of the First, that it was the next step in a long chain of disasters. The same people, the same ideas, just kept going. Through the 1920s, even though there was a republic on paper, and when Hitler came, he didn't invent new ideas. He used the dreams and goals of the old German nationalists, the ones who were already loud around the year 1900. So maybe we need to look at German history from Bismarck's fall to Hitler's rise as one long story. One thing led to the next. Even people like Alfred Hugenberg, an old nationalist leader, lived through it all from beginning to end. That's one way to look at it. Some say the time from 1890 to 1945 was one big chapter in world history written by Germany. Everything made sense. Everything was connected. But thinking like that makes things too simple. Still, nothing starts from nothing, and the closer something comes to happening, the more clearly we can see the signs that were already there. That's true for the First World War, and for Hitler, and even for the Weimar Republic. But we should not say that the German Empire was only the time when all this was getting ready. It was more than that. It had its own style, its own achievements, and some things that began in that time never got the chance to grow. Things could have gone differently. Historians always see the past with knowledge of how things ended. That makes it tempting to say it had to happen. But the future never looks so clear. Even the smartest predictions often turn out wrong. That should keep us humble when we look back. So, did it have to happen? Was the war already inside the empire from the start? Yes and no. History repeats some things, but it also brings new things. What's new grows out of the old, but it mixes with things no one could see coming. World events, chance, powerful people. That mix is what history is really made of. When Chancellor Bismarck lost power, Emperor Wilhelm I died in March of 1888. At the age of 91, his son Friedrich III became emperor, but he was already dying of cancer. He ruled for only 99 days and could barely speak. Friedrich and his British-born wife had long prepared for a liberal reform of the empire, but his death ended those hopes. Some believed that even if Friedrich had lived, the deeply flawed German system would have prevented real change. Still, others argued that a stronger, wiser emperor might have made a difference. His death disappointed the liberals, while conservatives and Bismarck were quietly relieved. The new emperor, Wilhelm II, was the third generation to take the throne. He admired his grandfather, Wilhelm I, and distrusted his liberal parents. He wanted to rule as a strong, Prussian-style monarch, not as a constitutional figurehead. He also admired Bismarck, at least at first. But Bismarck was now an old man, 73 years old, still convinced he alone could rule the empire. He had built the system to depend on himself and trained no true successor, only his unremarkable son, Herbert. He underestimated Wilhelm II, believing he could control him. By the year 1889, the relationship between Bismarck and the emperor had grown tense. Bismarck isolated himself on his estate. Though he still had a friendly majority of conservatives and liberals, he ignored them. Even his allies began turning against him. Ultimately, his downfall didn't come from Parliament. In the empire, power still rested with the emperor. Wilhelm II sensed public dissatisfaction and knew that many parties no longer supported Bismarck. Slowly, he prepared to act. The final break came over what was called the social question, a major issue that would mark the end of Bismarck's political era. Wilhelm was full of good intentions. He believed something had to be done for the poor workers. He said, "I am also the king of the poorest." He wanted to stop a red revolution with smart, peaceful changes. He wanted to be wiser than those famous kings from history who lost their heads because they were too stubborn. Bismarck thought all of this was nonsense. He didn't believe in kindness when it came to the Social Democrats. To him, they weren't a social problem. They were a threat to power and to peace. He believed the more you gave people, the more they would demand. By the late winter of 1889, Bismarck's grip on power was slipping. He clashed with the new emperor, Wilhelm II, especially over labor protections. The Kaiser wanted to support workers. Bismarck saw it as fake and unnecessary. He believed most workers didn't even want shorter hours or more rules. Bismarck was showing his age. He relied on old habits, warning of revolution, stirring up fear, but he seemed confused and out of touch. He no longer looked like the master of politics he had once been. At times, he was found crying, saying everyone had abandoned him. In January of 1890, the Reichstag repealed the anti-socialist laws that had been in place for 12 years. Bismarck still believed he was right. He told the emperor that the country had to be pushed to the edge. Only bloodshed, he argued, could justify stronger laws. But Wilhelm refused to accept that kind of thinking. Even conservatives found Bismarck too extreme. The fear of socialist revolution that had existed in 1848 was long gone. Then came the February elections. Bismarck suffered the worst defeat of his career. His coalition lost more than 1/3 of its seats. Liberals and Social Democrats nearly doubled theirs. It was more than a setback. It marked the collapse of the political system Bismarck had built since 1866. He couldn't make sense of the new world. He considered forming new alliances, even with parties he had always opposed, like the Poles or Alsatians. He thought about changing the constitution, limiting voting rights, or launching another anti-socialist campaign. At one point, he even considered a coup, but quickly let it drop. He tried to block the emperor's labor laws. He didn't want to give up power, but he also couldn't stay by obeying a younger man. That wasn't in his nature. By March of 1890, the end was near. Bismarck grew more bitter and sarcastic, but it was the anger of someone who had already lost. He had no real power left, just games and grudges. For 25 years, Bismarck had shaped Europe. He had been its strategist, even its judge. But unlike other strong men in history, he didn't have the will to go all the way. He didn't start a civil war. He didn't try to take over by force. In the end, he handed in a polite resignation letter, right when the young emperor demanded it. The army stayed loyal to the emperor. Parliament, weakened by Bismarck himself, didn't defend him. Most members hated him. He reached out to political leaders for support. They ignored him. He even invited Windthorst, the Centre Party leader, to his home. The meeting was brief and cold. Another conservative didn't even show up. Why visit a man who was already finished? In a final move, Bismarck turned to the public, but he didn't know how to lead a modern mass movement. He didn't build parties or stir crowds. He thought like a man from the early 19th century, still dreaming of royal guards firing on revolutionaries in the streets. But Bismarck was the last man who could rally the people against the king. The system he had built no longer served him. His staff turned away. Some even turned against him. The Austrian ambassador in Berlin noted the hypocrisy. All the people who once bowed to Bismarck were now tearing him apart, pointing out every mistake, every weakness. That's what happens when you treat people with contempt for too long. They pay you back. After Bismarck resigned in March of 1890, only one man followed him into exile, his son Herbert. Everyone else kept their jobs under the new chancellor, Caprivi. The final reason for his dismissal didn't matter much. The real causes had been building for more than a year. His resignation was quiet. The Berlin parliaments responded with silence. There were no speeches, no thanks. Wilhelm II could comfort himself with the thought that he had acted for the people, even if the people hardly reacted at all. Abroad, many were surprised by how little emotion Germans showed. But it made sense. Bismarck had spent decades suppressing or ignoring most of the population. Socialists, Catholics, liberals, and others. Why should they now mourn him? But over time, something shifted. Bismarck's name refused to disappear. His anger and pride lingered. His desire for revenge shaped politics even after he lost power. Though he and Wilhelm made a few symbolic gestures of peace, the wounds between them never really healed. Bismarck was not the kind of man to forgive, and even in his 70s, he refused to disappear. He stayed politically active. He read every newspaper. He wrote endlessly. He gave interviews. He judged every successor. His estate, Friedrichsruhe, became a kind of unofficial power center. He worked hard to control his legacy, dictating sharp, strategic memoirs that shaped public memory. Ironically, once out of power, Bismarck became more popular than ever. Cities that once hated him now cheered him. People, disappointed by Wilhelm's personal rule, began to see Bismarck as a lost voice of reason, even as a father figure. He used that public mood. He softened his message. He still claimed the emperor meant well, blaming bad advisors instead. And strangely, Bismarck began to speak like a democrat, calling for a strong constitution and real power for parliament, despite having spent decades undermining both. The most remarkable moment came in the summer of 1892. Bismarck toured Germany like a hero. Nobles avoided him, but the people welcomed him in city after city. It felt like the return of a national savior. After that, pilgrims came regularly to Friedrich's Ruhe. Veterans, students, local groups, they all arrived by special train, just to see him. The old man would come out onto the terrace, lift a champagne glass gifted by the crowd, and seem alive again for a moment. Near the end of his life, Bismarck became more than a man. He became a legend. During his public appearances, he would praise the Constitution, criticize the government, and join in singing patriotic songs like Deutschland über alles and Die Wacht am Rhein. Crowds marched by torchlight just to see him. One writer later confessed he would have joined too, just for a glimpse of that strange, commanding figure. But there was something false about this new cult. It didn't come from the people as a whole. The Social Democrats, Liberals, and the Center Party still rejected Bismarck. When he turned 80, the German parliament didn't even send a birthday message. But conservatives, nationalists, and frustrated aristocrats rallied around him. They turned him into a symbol of a stronger, more disciplined Germany, one that obeyed, conquered, and stood proud. To them, the Iron Chancellor was a rallying cry. They imagined he would have kept Russia as an ally, crushed the socialists and Catholics, and defended the farmers from free trade. He became the myth of a perfect Germany, united, disciplined, and powerful. A myth that outshone any living politician. Even Bismarck's real legacy faded under this image. He had once ruled carefully and conservatively, avoiding war, balancing powers, and resisting extremes. But after his fall, that caution was forgotten. He became a symbol of iron and destiny, embraced by the nationalist right, including anti-Semites and pan-Germanists, who dreamed of empire and racial unity. Bismarck, the man who once blocked a larger radical Germany in favor of a smaller conservative one, was now remembered as the champion of a different imagined Germany, one far more aggressive and authoritarian than he had ever allowed. Monuments to him, the Bismarck Towers, rose across the country. His myth outlived him. Reality, by comparison, always seemed disappointing. Both under Kaiser Wilhelm and during the Weimar Republic, no leader could match the fantasy of the man who had once ruled so tightly. And so Bismarck's shadow remained, until someone came along who believed himself greater than Bismarck. Only then did people begin to question the myth and look for the real man. By the end of Bismarck's life, the political system he had built was already crumbling. The young emperor who replaced him was not a monster, but he was shallow, self-centered, and completely unprepared for the role Bismarck's empire demanded of him. He was a man shaped by contradiction, torn between British liberalism and Prussian militarism, between romantic dreams of peace and dangerous fantasies of glory. He wanted to be loved, not feared. He was full of energy, charm, and vanity. The perfect performer, but not a leader. He gave wild speeches, but rarely acted. He loved parades, applause, and travel, not policy or responsibility. In truth, he never learned how to govern. His education was shallow, his worldview was narrow, and he was surrounded by men who fed his worst instincts. He looked like a modern ruler, but in his heart, he belonged to an older world, one of crowns, titles, and divine right. Yet despite all this, Wilhelm became the face of a modern empire. He no longer ruled Prussia alone, but the entire German Reich. Over time, even the old princes began to fade into the background.
The Kaiser became the true symbol of national power. Germany now followed Berlin.
Germany now followed Berlin. This shift from a Prussian kingdom to a German empire would have terrified Bismarck. He had built the Reich carefully, cautiously, tying it to Prussian authority and monarchy. But Wilhelm broke that balance. Now, imperial ambitions took center stage. Colonies, navy building, global power. And Wilhelm believed in the illusion of endless triumph. The people had to feel victorious. Every day had to feel like a holiday. The empire needed enemies to defeat and glories to chase. But this constant appetite for success pushed Germany into dangerous waters. Wilhelm understood the performance, the pageantry, the public energy. What he didn't understand was the system's fragility. He never saw the warnings. He thought he could keep walking across the ice forever, not realizing it had already begun to crack. By the late 1890s, Germany had become something new and strange. The old conservative, duty-bound monarchy of Prussia had mutated into a flashy, nervous empire, one without clear traditions or boundaries. Its ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm, acted more like a theater star than a king. Behind him stood a bloated, confused court, wealthy, brash, and often vulgar. Foreign financiers, opportunists, and speculators filled the royal circles. The style of the empire now matched its emperor, loud, uncertain, artificial. Even other German princes saw it. Some whispered about removing Wilhelm, but none of them could act. Their power was now tied to the survival of the imperial system. If Wilhelm fell, they would too. So they stayed quiet. And that, perhaps, is the most painful part of Bismarck's legacy. He had created a powerful empire, but one that could only survive under the illusion of constant success, ruled by a man who didn't understand the dangers he faced. Germany had once been ruled with sober discipline. Now it was ruled by spectacle. And the man at the center of it all, the man entrusted with the fate of the German people, had never been taught to lead. He only knew how to perform. Wilhelm II is often remembered as Germany's last king-like figure, but in truth he marked the beginning of a new kind of ruler, the modern strongman. Still, his reign wasn't one long crisis. For many Germans, life from the early 1890s to 1914 felt prosperous and safe. Cities thrived. The civil service was efficient. Public services improved. Even critics of the regime could speak fairly freely. As long as the economy was growing, both workers and the wealthy enjoyed the benefits. A period of peace, order, and cautious freedom. So why did it all fall apart? The truth is that Germany's political structure was deeply flawed. The empire was an industrial powerhouse, centralized, efficient, and modern. But it still rested on old dynastic foundations. In theory, it was a federation of monarchies. In practice, Prussia dominated everything, making up 2/3 of the empire. Yet it was governed by a completely different system. The Prussian king still ruled almost like an autocrat, thanks to the outdated 3-class voting system. But the emperor, who was also the Prussian king, had less formal power within the empire itself. He couldn't even veto legislation passed by the Reichstag and Bundesrat. In the middle of this contradiction stood the chancellor, the empire's only real executive, answerable only to the emperor, not to parliament. There was no unified imperial government in the modern sense. Each department was siloed, often run by powerful state secretaries who answered directly to the Kaiser. If one of them had a strong will or personal access to the crown, he could act almost independently. Bismarck had kept this messy structure together by sheer force. But after his departure, cracks began to spread. His first successor, Caprivi, tried to separate Prussia from the empire administratively, a logical move, but politically impossible. The roles were re-merged under Hohenlohe. The Bundesrat, which was supposed to represent the states, mostly rubber-stamped decisions. Real power flowed to Prussia and the imperial offices, while the Reichstag grew increasingly important, not in theory, but in practice. By the early 20th century, no chancellor could govern without the Reichstag's cooperation. None were ever overthrown directly by Parliament. Not Bismarck, not Caprivi, not Bülow, not Bethmann-Hollweg. But all were brought down by political defeats and loss of confidence in the chamber. Yet even as the Reichstag grew stronger, its power remained mostly negative. It could block, it could reject, but it couldn't build. It lacked the authority or the structure to create stable governments or carry out long-term reforms. The empire had no real parliamentary majority system, and because the chancellors were not appointed by Parliament, no one was truly accountable to the public. In the end, this created a dangerous imbalance, a modern state without modern politics, a growing democracy without democratic leadership, a powerful empire ruled by men who couldn't agree where power actually belonged. And that contradiction between imperial strength and political weakness would prove fatal. By the late 19th century, the German Reichstag had grown louder, more visible, and more combative, but it was still politically weak. It could block policy, expose scandal, or voice public anger, but it couldn't govern. It had no say in choosing the chancellor, no power to form a government, and no real connection to the executive. Some argue that this is normal, that parliaments are meant only to check governments, not to run them. But this depends on the system. In Germany, where no one bore clear responsibility and real power was hidden, the result was confusion. The government looked constitutional, but it wasn't. The structure created obedient citizens in a formally democratic world, and it taught no one how to actually govern. This helped explain why even the largest, most disciplined party in the country, the Social Democrats, remained excluded from power. The SPD, though massive and increasingly mainstream, was still treated as a threat. Authorities distrusted them, and their own ideology made them reluctant to share responsibility. Meanwhile, other parties shrank into interest groups. Catholics defended Catholic causes, conservatives defended big landowners, liberals sided with industrialists. New economic pressure groups gained power, often more than the parties themselves. The Central Association of German Industrialists, the Agrarian League, the Colonial Society, and others reached deep into the court and shaped public opinion. This wasn't unique to Germany. The United States had similar battles between business and politics, but in Germany, the tension between rising industrial interests and failing political structures was sharper, more exposed. Into this system stepped Caprivi, the man Wilhelm chose to follow Bismarck. Caprivi was honest, fair, and idealistic. Perhaps the most well-meaning chancellor Germany had between 1890 and 1918. He wanted to govern with reason and justice. He worked with anyone who shared his goals, liberals, Catholics, even Poles, and, possibly, Social Democrats. But he was politically naive. He believed good ideas
would win support on their own. He didn't understand that in German politics, backroom power, the court, the army, the Junkers, the lobbies, often outweighed principle. Still, Caprivi achieved more than many expected. He passed major labor reforms, Sunday rest, child labor restrictions, notice periods. He rejected Bismarck's anti-Polish policies in the East, and he reached outward, pushing trade agreements with Austria, Italy, Romania, and even Russia. But these gains triggered fierce backlash. The powerful landowning class, the agrarians, saw his free trade policies as betrayal. Their agrarian league used nationalist and anti-Semitic propaganda to fight him, demanding tariffs, subsidies, and state control over the grain market. As the young Max Weber warned, these landowners were undermining private property itself, asking the state to protect them from risk while preaching self-reliance. Caprivi's answer was calm and idealistic. The more our politics are shaped by economic interests, the more the government must hold fast to the bigger picture, to the state, the empire, and the common good. But his vision, balanced, inclusive, fair, was too advanced for the system he served. Caprivi's fall and the return to Bismarck's shadow. Chancellor Caprivi tried to steer Germany with fairness and foresight. He warned against anti-Semitism, reminding voters that hate is never controllable and might soon turn not just on Jews, but on property, on the state itself. His vision was one of shared duty and national responsibility. The state, he said, must protect all property, and also those with none. But Wilhelm II, ever uncertain, grew nervous. Though he initially stood with Caprivi, the Kaiser quickly fell back into old patterns. By 1894, Wilhelm once again saw subversive forces, social democrats, equal voting rights, as the greatest threat. Caprivi, tired and frustrated, stepped away from politics for good. He was followed by Prince Hohenlohe, a nobleman of intelligence and distance. His appointment signaled a shift back to Bismarck-style politics, quiet diplomacy, shallow reform, and unofficial alliance with conservatives. The flirtation with reform was over. Though Hohenlohe lacked Bismarck's fire, he kept the system steady. For a time, old enemies were no longer seen as threats. Even the Center Party became just another group to bargain with. A new anti-socialist campaign collapsed when the Reichstag refused to pass strike or emergency laws. Wilhelm could only shout threats at traitors, his favorite substitute for actual policy. Hohenlohe's years offered the illusion of calm. Diplomacy returned to old lines, friendship with Russia, pressure on the Poles. But the truth remained. The Bismarckian system had already failed. The energy of a modern Germany could no longer be frozen in place. A new stage, the world beyond. Germany's future no longer lay in internal stillness. It lay in world politics, in expansion, pride, and projection. This was not unique. Every great power, sooner or later, seeks its place on the global stage. Even ordinary citizens, if they feel part of the nation, want that nation to stand out in science, sport, trade, or strength. Colonialism in the 1880s was not driven by war, but by peace. Europe had become too stable to fight itself, so it turned outward. Africa and Asia became the stage for national competition. But this scramble for empire
was often more illusion than substance. Control was shallow. Settlements were small. Military and economic returns were limited. Germany joined this wave late and with little real strategy. Bismarck had never taken colonies seriously. He let France pursue its own ambitions, content to use colonialism as a distraction. The few German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were created after private ventures ran into trouble and begged the state for help. Germany's colonial administration was underdeveloped, expensive, and unprofitable. Few Germans moved to the colonies. The benefits went mostly to a small set of firms and shipping companies, all kept afloat by government subsidies. Even the Reichstag occasionally asked if the whole project was worth continuing. Chancellor Caprivi himself once admitted, the colonies were not born from need, but from fantasy. Germany's shift to global ambition. What began in the 1880s as scattered colonial improvisation turned, by the 1890s, into a full-blown ideology. Germany must become a world power, or be left behind. Global events like the Sino-Japanese War, the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the Spanish-American War triggered new fears and ambitions. Germans asked, where would power lie in the future? Would Berlin rival London or Washington? Influenced by writers like Alfred Mahan, Rudyard Kipling, and racial theorists like Chamberlain, Germany's leaders embraced a belief in racial and national destiny. Britain was admired and envied. Wilhelm II, part English himself, saw empire as both a duty and a dream. Germany rushed to copy Britain's global model, but without its centuries of experience. German colonial policy was blunt, often driven more by fantasy than strategy. One supporter said plainly, colonies exist to enrich Germany at the expense of the weak. The word world became central to national language. Weltstaat Berlin, Weltpolitik, world politics, Weltmacht Deutschland, world power Germany. Groups like the Pan-German League, though small in number, had deep influence. They were supported by writers, businessmen, and patriotic leagues. They wanted more than colonies. They wanted Lebensraum, living space for the German people. This meant expansion into Eastern Europe, Africa, South America, even rule over lesser peoples. Their ideology blended nationalism with racism, pride with paranoia. They claimed Germans were destined to lead civilization and demanded power to match that destiny. They also pushed for continental dominance. Germany, they argued, could not project power globally unless it first secured leadership in Europe. Otherwise, its empire was a facade. Though radical, these ideas spread far beyond fringe politics. They appealed to much of the middle class and helped shape the popular mood of the time. They also shaped government thinking, even when leaders pretended otherwise. The Navy as national symbol. Nothing symbolized Germany's new ambitions more than the Navy. Led by Admiral Tirpitz since 1897, it quickly became the world's second strongest fleet. Tirpitz was practical, strategic, and a brilliant organizer. He used public campaigns, press offices, patriotic leagues, and even novelists to turn the Navy into a national passion. But the fleet, for all its size and cost, was never used. When World War I began, it stayed in harbor. It became a monument to failed ambition, pride with no purpose. Germany's colonies, places like Kiao Chau in China or islands in the Pacific,
were symbolic. They existed mainly to justify the navy, which in turn was built to defend the colonies. As Wilhelm Liebknecht noted at the time, this isn't about land. It's about giving a fake purpose to a navy with no function.
Germany was imitating older empires, but lacked the depth or position to succeed. Britain and France had long experience and global reach. Germany, locked in the center of Europe, had neither. It was building a global empire from an inland position, with no strategic center and no unifying logic. It was an empire of illusion, an illusion of empire, Germany's global reach and strategic missteps. By the late 19th century, the rush for colonies in Africa, China, and the Pacific was more illusion than reality. All major European powers participated, but few gained lasting value. Even intelligent observers, like historian Hans Delbrück, were caught in the fear that if Germany didn't join the race, it would be left behind. One imperial project that seemed more realistic was the Baghdad Railway, linking Berlin to the Persian Gulf. It promised new markets and symbolized the global ambitions of German liberalism. But Germany lacked control over the territory, the ports, and even the trade. The railway remained a dream, more symbolic than useful. These symbolic efforts, colonies, the fleet, the railway, were part of Weltpolitik, the belief that Germany had to become a global power. The man who embodied that ambition was Bernhard von Bülow, Chancellor from 1900 to 1909. Bülow was worldly, charming, and politically skilled, but lacked true vision. He wanted to please everyone, the Kaiser, Parliament, and foreign powers. His strategy was to maintain the broken system Bismarck left behind rather than reform it for a modern democratic era. While domestic reform stalled, Germany's foreign policy became bolder and more dangerous. Power became the obsession of all major nations. By the early 1900s, Europe had split into rival alliances, Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, Dual Alliance, France and Russia. This was the opposite of Bismarck's careful diplomacy, which had tried to keep France and Russia apart. Many blamed the lapse of Bismarck's reinsurance treaty with Russia for the shift. But in reality, Russia and France had already been moving closer due to shared fear of Germany's growing power. Bismarck had tried to manage alliances with secrecy and double-dealing. That strategy was never sustainable. The Franco-Russian alliance formed not from treaties, but from shared survival instincts, a belief that Germany might soon dominate Europe. Only the socialists offered a different vision, of peace through international worker solidarity. But they lacked the power to stop the nationalist tide, a missed alliance with Britain. At the turn of the century, Britain was also looking for new allies. Weary of imperial conflicts with Russia and uneasy about European instability, it could have chosen Germany. The two had shared culture, trade, and political systems. Germany's disputes with Britain were minor, but Bülow fumbled the opportunity. He asked too much, especially British support for the Triple Alliance, and offered too little. Germany believed it could remain admired, feared, and alone. That belief was fatal. Britain responded by ending its own isolation. 1901, treaty with Japan. 1904, Entente Cordiale with France. 1907, agreement with Russia. Though these were not formal alliances, they reduced tension among Britain's rivals and left Germany isolated. Germany chose pride over pragmatism, betting that it could lead alone. But history shows that refusing to choose is often the worst choice of all. At the moment Britain opened the door, Germany turned inward, and the balance of power in Europe began to shift permanently against it. Germany, before 1914, pride, isolation, and missed chances. By 1907, and even more so by 1911, Britain had quietly moved closer to France and Russia, forming what became known as the Triple Entente. Though it was never a formal alliance, it was real. Meanwhile, Germany's Triple Alliance, with Austria-Hungary and Italy, was falling apart. Italy was unreliable. Only Hungary, within Austria-Hungary, remained loyal. Germany found itself surrounded. Was this inevitable? Historians still debate it. Some say war with Britain was bound to happen, that Germany's desire to dominate Europe left no room for peace. Others argue it was a diplomatic failure, a tragedy of poor decisions rather than destiny. What's certain is this: it wasn't about economics. Germany and Britain were major trading partners, nor was it about hate. Until the late 19th century, Germany had been respected across the English-speaking world as the land of Goethe, Humboldt, and Kant. Only in the last decade before the First World War did this admiration fade, a world losing patience. In 1906, Max Weber wrote that Germany was becoming a joke in the world's eyes, not for what it did, but because it tolerated Wilhelm II. He blamed the Kaiser's ego and Tirpitz's ambition for destroying British trust. The naval arms race, driven more by pride than strategy, made Germany look threatening, even if it didn't mean to. But Germany wasn't alone in its delusions. Every great power, France, Russia, Italy, even Montenegro, dreamed of glory, conquest, and expansion. Each prepared for war as if it were both inevitable and necessary. Peace movements existed, even in Germany, but they were weak. The public laughed them off as Jews, socialists, and hysterical women, in the cruel words of a Russian minister. International peace conferences in The Hague in 1899 and 1907 were more for show than substance. They proposed limits on weapons and courts to settle disputes, but these were mostly ignored. Germany refused to even discuss arms limits. Why? Because it still saw itself as a rising power, not a defender of the status quo. To freeze the world order would be to accept permanent second place, something Germany would never do. Germany's diplomatic blindness. Germany's foreign policy was shaped not by strategy, but by pride and fear. A small circle of men, the Kaiser, his advisors, a few diplomats, made all the key decisions. One of the most powerful was Friedrich von Holstein, the secretive shadow master of the Foreign Office. Later blamed for Germany's isolation, he was just one part of a much bigger pattern. Germany's isolation before 1914 wasn't caused by a single bad treaty or one missed alliance. It was the result of a series of choices, all rooted in the national mood, a belief in greatness, a hunger for recognition, a refusal to accept limits. Even the British decision to oppose Germany in 1914 wasn't sudden or shallow. It reflected years of rising tension and the growing sense that Germany had become a threat. And when Britain made that same decision again in 1939, it showed something deeper. This wasn't just about moments or missteps. It was about who Germany had become and how the world responded to it. And it would be wrong to imagine that a wise, peaceful people were dragged into war by a mad, foreign tyrant. That wasn't how things worked in early 20th century Germany. The regime didn't exist in a vacuum. Even under the Prussian Constitution, no king could rule purely by the grace of God anymore. The government still relied on thousands of connections between those in power and those they ruled. Kaiser Wilhelm II didn't express the full spirit of his time, but he did reflect a part of the national character, and he did it well. Had the German parliament, the Reichstag, been strong enough, Wilhelm might have been forced to accept a more democratic system, but it wasn't. The system, shaped by Bismarck, had left voters disconnected from power, trained only to look out for their material interests and leave the rest to those up there. The will to govern had faded. Even if Wilhelm had seized all power for himself, that wouldn't have guaranteed success. He simply wasn't up to the task. That lesson would become painfully clear in the years ahead. The parties, the Reichstag, and the Social Democrats. Chancellors continued to hunt for working majorities in the Reichstag. Like Bismarck before them, they made deals. They handed out jobs in exchange for cooperation. The two most common political alliances were conservatives with the Catholic Center Party or conservatives with the Liberals. Chancellor Bülow ruled from 1900 to 1909 with the latter coalition, while attacking the Social Democrats and the Center Party with little success. Some thinkers hoped for a third path, a broad coalition of liberals and Social Democrats which could push for real parliamentary reform, the kind of change that would finally modernize the Imperial Constitution. But that was easier said than done. The problem was Prussia. In the Prussian parliament, conservatives enjoyed nearly absolute control, thanks to the three-class voting system and the aristocratic dominance of the upper house. So even if the Social Democrats were rising in the Reichstag, they were locked out of power in Prussia. A chancellor who governed with conservatives in one arena and socialists in the other. Politically impossible, even for someone as flexible as Bülow. He didn't try. Still, Bülow occasionally spoke with the more moderate wing of the Social Democratic Party. And by now, the party itself had changed. It was no longer a sharp, unified weapon forged in the fire of Bismarck's repression. It had become a massive, complex organization, diverse in ideas, leaders, and strategies. Around the turn of the century, revisionism began to take hold. Its main theorist, Eduard Bernstein, argued that it was time to revise some of the key ideas in Marxist theory. Bernstein didn't think capitalism was heading for collapse. In fact, he claimed, workers were seeing real improvement in their lives. Thanks to their own struggle, yes, but improvement all the same. The middle class and small businesses hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, many were thriving in new sectors. The rich weren't necessarily getting fewer. The poor weren't always getting poorer. In short, Bernstein said, the great breakdown that Marx had predicted wasn't coming. Social democracy between doctrine and nation. If it was true, as it increasingly appeared to be, that the German worker was living better than ever before, then that fact had everything to do with the success and profits of German industry. And if that was the case, how could a party like the SPD, Social Democratic Party, which drew its strength from these very workers, continue to operate on the assumptions of a theory of collapse? The old theory of inevitable proletarian impoverishment, of crisis leading to revolution, no longer matched the facts, not at home and not even in the colonies. Yes, exploitation existed. Yes, injustices abounded. But the day-to-day reality of the German worker was improving, not because capitalism was just, but because socialism, even as a critical voice, was working within the system. That led to a gradual shift from categorical rejection to detailed critique. The SPD no longer denounced colonialism as a whole. Instead, it began to focus on how things were done and what could be improved. And in part due to social democratic pressure, some aspects of colonial administration did improve. It was a pragmatic evolution, though not without contradiction. The party still claimed loyalty to a revolutionary Marxist tradition. It still publicly embraced the dream of world socialism and the rhetoric of class war. But in practice, it negotiated, participated, and slowly reshaped the state. The Party of Revolution was becoming a pillar of reform. This contradiction was not necessarily a failure. It was a reflection of the world the SPD operated in, a complex society, economically advanced, politically rigid, but slowly opening. Germany was not split in two, not socialists here and everyone else there. The lines were blurred, the identities overlapping. The SPD grew not by remaining pure, but by becoming real. Even its relationship to nationalism shifted. The party that once saw the fatherland as a bourgeois illusion had by now come to speak in its name. The same August Bebel who had fiercely opposed the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine in 1870 now warned against Germany's naval arms race, condemned the rising anti-British hysteria, and called for reconciliation. He did not view war, imperialism, or great power rivalry as inevitable. He wished for friendship between Germany and Britain, just as did liberal financiers, exporters, aristocrats, and scholars. He was no cynical observer. He was a citizen and a patriot, in a new socialist sense. The SPD maintained strong ties with its sister parties across Europe, and in theory still believed in the old plan, that in the event of war, an international general strike would stop the machines of destruction. But in practice, they began preparing for another possibility. If Russia were to attack, they would fight. And Bebel made that plain. If it comes to war with Russia, he said, we socialists will march as one. It was the voice of a man who still thought in the language of 1848, now applied to a world where Russia was allied with France. It was a different time, and a different party. In 1913, the SPD voted for the War Contribution Bill, a special wealth tax to fund the latest expansion of the army. It shocked some, but it was no longer anything revolutionary. The party had already, bit by bit, accepted the logic of state participation. Their support for military measures, when framed as national defense, flowed naturally from a position the party had grown into. Germany was deeply divided, but it was not simply divided into socialists and everyone else. That binary had never existed, except in the neat predictions of Marxist theory. In real life, German society was far too complex, and so too was the SPD. At that time, almost the entire world believed that German industry had to become as independent as possible from the politically unstable, ever-shifting global market. The supply of raw materials and access to foreign markets, it was said, must be guaranteed by the German Empire itself. Given that even the representatives of the working class found it difficult to reject the idea of colonies and spheres of influence outright, the new approach became, do it better, do it more justly, do it without saber-rattling, but no longer do nothing at all. In the late autumn of the year 1908, for a few brief days, it seemed as though a breakthrough toward democratic reform might actually be imminent. The spark was trivial, an interview the Kaiser had given to a London newspaper. In it, he bemoaned the lack of understanding from the English and complained about how hard he worked, unappreciated, to foster better Anglo-German relations. These were mild indiscretions by the standards of what the German public had come to expect from their emperor. And yet, this time, the reaction was explosive. A storm of outrage swept through Germany, such as no Prussian king had faced since the revolutionary days of March 1848. Even the conservatives joined the Social Democrats in denouncing the emperor. The public trust had collapsed. From press to parliament, the cry went up, "This cannot go on." The Social Democrats called for action. Real ministerial responsibility and the appointment of ministers by parliament is now the order of the day, declared Georg Ledebour. You have the chance, because of the widespread discontent in the nation, to win a truly democratic parliamentary government. And because you have that chance, you must take it. All that's missing is the courage of free men. The Chancellor, Prince von Bülow, found himself caught between Kaiser and Reichstag. Very reluctantly, he sided with the Parliament. He acknowledged the Kaiser's misstep as a deeply regrettable misfortune and promised it would not happen again. "Let us ensure," he said, "that this misfortune does not become a catastrophe." The Kaiser, alarmed by the fury, withdrew from the public eye, brooding and fearing the worst. There was even talk of abdication. But within weeks, the storm had passed. The moment had dissolved. A nation without a nation. Elections like those of 1912, votes like that of December 1913, pointed to a deep internal crisis, but gave no clue as to its resolution. The author of these lines has often asked elderly Germans, "What did you imagine the future looked like in 1913? What did you hope for?" No one could give a clear answer. Other nations had crises too. England had fought a bitter constitutional battle in 1909 and 10, then saw class warfare and the threat of civil war in Ireland. France remembered the Dreyfus affair, its recent civil rift. Italy never knew peace with itself. Its government was a mixture of corruption and sham parliamentarism. Russia faced its own death agony, a crumbling autocracy. Compared to Russia, Germany seemed a paradise of law and order. But that said little. Every state had problems. Yet France had an identity. Germany did not. There was no genuine opposition in Germany because there was no genuine government. Bureaucracy, the army, the navy, industrialists, agrarians, workers, civil servants, parties, all operated separately, often in conflict, without cohesion. There was still, at its core, no nation, in the full sense that the older national states had achieved. And yet for all this inner fragmentation, Germany remained a colossus. Its population grew by nearly 1 million each year. Its industry was second only to that of the United States. Its army was unparalleled in strength, brilliance, and impotence, side by side. In the closing lines of his book, The German Economy in the 19th Century, economist Werner Sombart, one of the most respected minds of the Kaiserreich, posed the question, "What of the spirit of this remarkable state?" His answer was grim. The great ideals that had once inspired the nation had faded. The national idea had burned itself out. What remained was a second-hand nationalism, loud but empty,
a dull chant meant to mask inner decay. The old political ideals had either been realized or found to be hollow. The younger generation, he wrote, sneered at the memory of past struggles for freedom. Public ceremonies became farces. New ideals had not emerged. As spiritual goods disappeared, material interests took their place. The masses, no longer bound by any higher vision, rallied instead to class identity or to economic self-interest, like the agrarian lobby, transient, reactionary, and self-serving. Sombart, a bourgeois patriot, lamented that even passion for political principles had vanished. In their place reigned cynical opportunism, dry pragmatism, and a lifeless routine. Who now, he asked, could speak with passion about the meaning of state-run industry, of free trade, of workers' protection, or of cooperative systems? Who could argue with fire about the rights of labor? That such a people had sunk so low, this was the true political crisis of the era. Some would later look back from the 1920s and idealize the parliament of the Kaiserreich. Just as in that earlier time, others had looked back wistfully to Bismarck. And already in Bismarck's day, people longed for 1848. We are always vulnerable to optical illusions of decline and lost greatness. But even if we account for that, what remained was a nationalism shouting but heartless, masking material greed, sustaining corruption, and feeding off the worship of success. Sombart, for all his bourgeois pride, saw it. So did Heinrich Mann in his novel The Loyal Subject, with ruthless clarity. And a generation earlier, Nietzsche had noted it in his savage, lonely scribblings. It was not a noble style. The path to disaster between 1905 and 1914. The logic of escalation. In a letter exchange between former German chancellors during the First World War, each tried, politely, to shift the blame for the catastrophe. Bethmann Hollweg described the years leading to the war as a sequence of forced risk-taking, driven by growing German isolation and Austria's decline. Each new crisis, Morocco, Bosnia, Morocco, again, pushed Germany further into a pattern of brinkmanship. Germany believed it could manage the tensions. It was the most powerful country in Europe and had convinced itself that it would never have to choose or be forced into war. But every attempt to break the encircling ring of France, Russia, and Britain only hardened it. Economics connected, politics divided. Germany's rising economy did not cause fear, it created interdependence. Its industrial links with France, England, and even Russia grew tighter, not looser. But politics, not trade, drove the conflict. Political culture still operated on 19th century principles: prestige, spheres of influence, power games, and racial national myths. Romantic nonsense about civilizational clashes, Germanic versus Slavic versus Latin, fueled militarism, especially in Germany, Russia, and France. The German government trumpeted its strength in foreign affairs while alienating nearly everyone. At each turn, it chose displays of power over compromise, the illusion of control. By summer 1914, Britain and Germany were discussing agreements on Baghdad-Bahn, spheres of influence, and even colonial issues. Some British socialists and liberals still saw Germany as a more civilized partner than Tsarist Russia. There was room for agreement, but not under the system in place. Tirpitz blocked naval compromises. The General Staff refused to revise its two-front war plans. Russia feared German power. France remained loyal to Russia. No side could afford to back down. Even the Social Democrats, morally clearer than others, were unable to imagine a peaceful way out. They hated the idea of war with France and Britain, but accepted the possibility of war with Russia, France's ally. Their warnings were noble, but powerless. Bebel's prophecy. In 1911, August Bebel delivered a haunting prediction in the Reichstag. He foresaw, "One day, one side will say, 'This cannot go on,' or, 'If we wait longer, we will be the weaker.' Then comes the catastrophe. Then comes the general mobilization. 16 to 18 million men, armed with the finest killing machines. And behind this war, Bebel warned, stood mass bankruptcy, mass misery, mass unemployment. The Parliament laughed. He told them, "You laugh, but it is coming, not through us, through you."